Thank you for joining me today to talk about why we should be talking about collections as data. And I want to clarify, because I just had this conversation with someone in the audience, that the we are referring to in this question that's posed by the Birds of a Feather session is the RDM professionals, the RDM community research data managers. So people like who are represented by organizations like RDA and CoData, and probably a lot of people in this room. I can't scroll anything. Do I need a mouse? Oh, I don't have a, oh, this is a clicker. I'm learning this. You are watching me learn what I'm doing. Green one. No, I don't want to advance the slide. I want to see the rest of my notes. Thank you. I mean, I guess I could do this without notes, but it's always nicer. Oh, thank you. Okay, so we are talking about this in the context of RDA because this topic is being talked about elsewhere. There's a growing body of work shaping the way collecting institutions are building and sharing digital collections. Oh, and my notes are moving all over the place. This is fun. Okay, I'm hoping the outcome of this session will be that RDA members start sharing in this evolving conversation. That's where I was going with this. This is what you need to know. We're exploring today how we might think about forming an interest group that would help us to better engage with the topic and engage with others who are already making progress on this topic. So the session today is split into two parts. The first half is going to be presentations from people who have been involved in collections as data work in some capacity, whether they are at the start of their journey or they have some strategy already established to deal with this type of data, and they're beginning to refine their thinking. I've asked them to reflect on some challenges that they've encountered in doing this type of work and to comment on how RDA engagement might benefit them. And I want to kind of put a caveat out here that some of our presenters are current RDA members, but some of them, many of them, I think on this panel are new here and are maybe a little bit unsure of what they were signing themselves up for by participating in the session. So I encourage us all to extend a warm RDA community welcome. The second half of the session is going to be a more open discussion, and I hope that we keep more or less to time, even though I started us off fairly late. I will try to be really quick. The desired end goal, again, is going to be to gather up all the ideas that could feed into an interest group on this topic and to just sort of gauge the interest within the RDA in continuing sustaining this conversation. So something to consider today as you're sitting in the room preparing for the discussion. How does this work also fit into or complement data practice discussions that are happening around other types of data? And in order to have that discussion, I think we kind of need a definition for our starting point. So we need to talk about what we're talking about when we're talking about collections as data. Okay, so when I proposed this session, I was thinking primarily about cultural heritage collections found in libraries, archives, museums, or what we would typically call memory institutions. And I wanted to pitch a cultural heritage interest group that really dealt with the processes and resources that use the information resources created by memory institutions. I still think this is a really good place to begin, even though I recognize now, having talked to some of my panelists, that this conversation might go in different places. So let's consider, though, as our starting point, collections data to be both the metadata created to describe a resource, as well as digital representations that are created from those resources or of those resources. This information has historically been thought of as surrogate or supplementary information. It was needed for discovery. Like we see the card catalog here, you put this information down, you go to the library, you can get the book that may be on a subject or by an author or from a time period or location that you are interested in. It's giving you what you need to discover the resource. Again, many collections professionals are recognizing that the way this information is being used now, though, is evolving beyond its original purpose. And it may not necessarily be fit for the new purposes that it is being put to. Digitized collections are increasingly the items that are being interrogated by researchers and utilized as interpretive resources in and of themselves. And as Thomas will probably explain better than I can in his presentation that follows mine, this is a fundamental reframing of these digital resources that I think kind of scares and energizes a lot of people in the collections field, and should be something that is really exciting to think about just generally in terms of the research data landscape. A lot of the collections as data discussions are emerging from collections professionals. So just to reiterate, there are conversations that are happening in this space. They are asking if the access pathways and delivery mechanisms that they have been providing are still supporting the desired use of the materials. And this is just a sampling of some of the places that you can go to find out how people are thinking about collections as data and the work that is emerging around this space. So I recognize that this is a very simplified, short introduction, but hopefully it gives us a launching point for a broader discussion to follow, which will consider other perspectives and motivations that are being brought to collections as data work. It's a work in progress. All right, so now I'm going to hand it over to me. I'm going to start the presentations. And kick off the discussion by talking about work that I've been doing in the collections as data space with the World Fair Project. The World Fair Project is a European-funded project to explore how the sharing of research data differs across disciplines in order to promote more fair-aligned practices that are really rooted in disciplinary needs and disciplinary work, and therefore taking that disciplinary perspective, better facilitating the sharing of data across disciplines. You're going to hear about the World Fair Project probably a few more times over the course of this conference. One of the things that we are working towards, one of the work packages, is producing a cross-domain interoperability framework, which is being informed by all of these different pieces of the pie here that are exploring different disciplines. So I'm not going to say too much more about the scope of World Fair, because again, there's lots of places within this conference, including a booth just outside by the tables that has some cards and more information about the World Fair Project. DRI is leading the Cultural Heritage Work Package. I work for the Digital Repository of Ireland. I'm now realizing I don't think I introduced myself right off the bat. I'm Beth Kazook. I work for the Digital Repository of Ireland, and I'm the project manager for research data and also the work package lead for the World Fair Project. Cultural Heritage Work Package lead for the World Fair Project. So what are some things that we've been doing within the World Fair Project related to cultural heritage collections as data? Key outputs included a mapping of current practices around digitized and digital collections in the field, identifying potential areas for improved support for the FAIR principles. A working group was convened in early January 2023 that worked on a set of recommendations, that brainstormed things that came out of that mapping report. And this is kind of a representation of thought processes that we went through in the working group, exploring what are the categories of things that cultural heritage institutions should really be thinking about. Some of the key findings from a review of current practice around digital collections delivery were that a lot of work already aligns with FAIR, yay, especially the F and the A. Libraries and archives and museums are pretty good about findability and access. That is something that is in their mandate and has been for a long time. A lot of the areas for improvement identified, though, were kind of tied to the fact that we think about digital collections as surrogate records, to bring it back to that point I was making earlier. We think about them for reference, for display, rather than data to be questioned, rearranged, and reused. So from these key findings, we produced a recommendations report that crystallized some of these broad categories of things that we were exploring, which ultimately surfaced, the goal of which was ultimately to surface information about how collections are managed in order to help promote better reuse. A lot of things like the citation model that we recommended, which would identify the actual digital image that you are referencing as opposed to the thing that might be captured in that digital image. Transparency around the technical metadata that might be created for digitized records, digital images. Data documentation, looking at things like data sheets, which could better explain how this collection material came to be in your collection, what is the larger context for it in the museum or the archive, really dealing with licensing and rights. A lot of cultural heritage institutions don't necessarily think of licensing their works. They're very good on the rights side of things, but licensing is kind of a whole new field. And then ultimately delivery, we were looking at things like improved support for identifier schemas, APIs, different ways that you could make the actual images more exchangeable. And so we actually, DRI is looking quite strong, or has implemented the IIIF image sharing format, and we are kind of recommending that others look at that too. All right, the recommendations were broad and generalizable enough to have different implementations for different repositories and institutions, which also means that the choices that we've made to implement them at DRI might differ from choices that others would make. And so because I challenged the rest of my speakers to put up some challenges and considerations of what this IG could talk about, I threw this in here. I'd like to know if anyone's using the recommendations from the World Fair report and how they're thinking they might apply in their specific contexts. We have started a blog series on the Digital Repository of Ireland website. It's also on the World Fair Project website that is asking some of our World Fair working group members to do the same thing. What would an implementation of new licensing and rights mean in a South African context, for instance? So you can go and check out that evolving blog as we hopefully get more perspective there. We are also, as part of the World Fair project, we created fair implementation profiles right at the start. Each of the disciplines did, and we were supposed to do it kind of broadly for our discipline, but we wound up just doing it for DRI. Like, what do we do to support cultural heritage rather than looking at the whole scope of cultural heritage? I've now invited some of our working group members to contribute fair implementation profiles as well, and that would be really interesting to trial with an RDA interest group to see what kinds of, like basically how large that profile can be expanded to really capture the whole of cultural heritage work. All right, and this is the point at which I hand it over to Thomas, who I hope is able to hear me online because he is not with us in the room today.
Hey, I think I'm here. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I can.
Oh, good. Beth, would you like to advance slides, or can I share slides?
I think I might have to advance them. Yeah, okay, that's the tech team is nodding at me, so let me know when to click.
Okay, great. Well, I'll start by saying thank you to Beth for organizing. Beth deserves all the credit for this session. Super excited to be joining you all. I wish I could have been there in person. The last time I was at RDA was when it was held in Helsinki on a beautiful series of fall days. So a little bummed I couldn't come, but happy I can participate virtually. So I'm going to talk a bit about two different efforts that I've been working on. One called Always RD Computational and one called Part to Whole. Collections as Data is the thing that links both of these projects. Advanced slide, please. The first project began in 2017. It was called Always RD Computational, Collections as Data. And that was really sort of like a community capacity building effort, primarily based in the United States for roughly 3 years. We were really trying to sort of formalize values to guide memory organization or cultural heritage organization work in the space of, how do we develop and provide access to machine actionable collections for research purposes. Following that effort, moved on into the current effort. It's called Collections as Data Part to Whole. It's supported by the Mellon Foundation. And that has really been a broad experiment in moving toward implementation of kind of, what we think it might look like depending upon variation in organizational context, mission, resources, number of full-time employees, kinds of collections. What does it actually look like in practice to develop, provide access to, and I think crucially, sustainably support the use of computational research with the collections that we steward. Next slide. For that first effort, always already computational, part of the springboard, I guess, or the distillation of what that project was trying to explore was this notion that much of the work that memory organization practitioners working in libraries and archives and so forth have been doing is to sort of work on digitizing things and then getting representations of those things online. So, a lot of the ways that we approach development of infrastructure to provision access to digital collections really tried to kind of like replicate how we might expect a researcher would interact with, say, a book or an image in a physical space, holding it in hand and so forth. So we had sort of these interface experiences online and accompanying metadata and object production that sought to sort of emulate a physical interaction. And what we were finding is that while there's certainly a large user community of people that want to read digitized books or look at digitized images, that the design assumptions in terms of description and access did not readily support researchers who wanted to work with digital collections as research data, essentially. And so Always Ready Computational was really focused on trying to identify what challenges and opportunities there were, and putting on sort of a different mental model of researcher experience and collection access. Essentially, we tried to figure out, what does it look like for us to provide access to not just collections or digitized collections, but collections that are intended to be used as data at scale. Next slide. Fast forward a few years to 2020, an auspicious year. I'm joking, perhaps a bad joke, but basically that was the beginning of the pandemic. I would not advise anyone try and do a community capacity building project during a pandemic, but here we are. In 2020, the conversation had evolved a bit for us, where we thought we had done sort of some of that initial community building, and we kind of moved on to, how do we now practically responsibly produce and support the use of collections as data for research, education, and creative purposes. Next slide. We sought to answer that question through a cohort program where we awarded around $600,000 US to 12 different organizations in the United States to experiment with collections as data implementation. In support of the cohort of 12 institutions, we formed an institute for cohort building and experience sharing, and also provided summative institutes for cohort sharing of experience and reflection. Next slide. Each cohort created what we called an implementation model, an organizational model, and also produced a new collections as data that was explicitly focused on underrepresented histories. The implementation model was sort of the stack of workflow and staff responsibility that produced collections as data. And the organizational models were intended more to sort of describe how an organization would then support researcher use of the collections as data. How might something like data science support need to change, or research data management support, or digital scholarship support? How might it need to change if more of the organization's collections were provided in the vein of them being data for a broad set of research purposes? Next slide. In thinking about how to foster the broadest impact possible, we were pretty intentional in selecting what kinds of organizations receive funding through the project. We really sought to diversify across large and small organizations and organizations of different types. Everything from very large private universities like Harvard University or public universities like the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, down to very small 4-person historical societies focused on African American history in New York, to museums like the Carnegie Museum of Art. The idea here being that through the sort of seeding of experimentation at different kinds of institutions, that we would produce models for doing collections as data work that would suggest a series of different paths for organizations with different resources, missions, and collections. Next slide. Just as a quick example of a project that was funded through Part to Whole, I'm going to talk briefly about the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and their effort to embrace what we call interprofessionalism. Essentially, it means collaboration across roles and departments within a library. Next slide. Their project was called On the Books, Jim Crow and Algorithms of Resistance. And interesting project. I mean, essentially what they were trying to do was to kind of figure out, given sort of digitized holdings of textual materials, could they computationally identify various kinds of laws that were used to affect segregation and racial discrimination in North Carolina. Required a pretty robust and, for them, I think, new and novel form of collaboration between digital scholarship services, so like a public service, their special collections, their archives, research data management team, also involved in their team, an end user, a professor of history, and an impactful project for them where they've subsequently secured additional funding to establish a multi-state initiative to extend the methods that they applied to their collections here across multiple states in the American South, with the endpoint being that they're going to produce a data set, from these historic collections that will support a range of scholars that are trying to better understand the history of racial discrimination in the American South. Next slide. And this is just a release notifying the world of the project expansion to the broader American South. Next slide. Now, sort of running concurrent to our work on Part to Whole, we started to see sort of a proliferation of international collections as data efforts expressed in Australia, in Scotland, in England, in Belgium, at the level of collections as data conferences, collections as data access projects, research lab-driven collections as data experimentation, and even national strategy on how to make collections as data a priority. Next slide. As Part to Whole comes to a close this year, or has come to a close, I guess, just recently, last month, we thought that it would be useful to try to connect the work that we have been doing in the United States with these broader international efforts that we were seeing. So we held an international working event at Internet Archive Canada in Vancouver, British Columbia. We brought together about 18 countries, 60 organizations represented at that event. We tried to be quite global in terms of representation. And you'll see in the quick listing here that moving beyond sort of the United States and Western Europe, we also were able to have the benefit of organizations participating from the Philippines, Argentina, Brazil, Singapore, and so on. Super productive event. Some of the outcomes that have come from that event. Next slide. Have been the articulation of a new deliverable called the Vancouver Statement on Collections as Data, which is essentially a set of principles prioritized by the 60 organizations represented at the event on a sort of a global level that seek to sort of guide I guess like the ethically grounded production of collections as data. We've had that Vancouver Statement translated into 3 additional languages professionally, so Spanish, French, and Arabic. Saskia Scheltjens at the Rijksmuseum has also supported a translation of Dutch, and we may support additional translations into Chinese as well. So that's upcoming. Next slide. This is a screenshot of the final white paper from this project from my computer yesterday, working on a Sunday. So it's almost done. I don't typically do that, but I just wanted to flag that the white paper kind of reporting out on this effort, and also our thoughts about sort of how folks interested in collections as data might move forward broadly on a global level. That should be coming out in early to mid-November. So get excited. Next slide. And this is the final slide for me. Our interest as an effort working on collections as data community building is to work together to bring together a global community of collections as data work and to support generative, interdisciplinary, interprofessional, and intercultural collaboration. This event is very much in that spirit. This community is very much in that spirit. I was so impressed by my participation in Helsinki RDA when this opportunity came up to kind of have this conversation in this venue. I was super excited about it, and I still am. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. You've downplayed your importance in shaping the conversation that we're going to be having today. Definitely going to Vancouver and being a part of that large international group where you brought everybody together. That's where we first started having the conversation of, well, where do we meet again? What happens? What happens when we all go back off to our own professional societies and conferences that are really kind of tailored to our communities or to our particular slice of the collections profession? And RDA came up as a place that could be a community grounding point where we could bring what's happening in all of these other places together to have discussions. So, next. Let's move on to some short presentations from people who are engaged in the collections as data space. Sally, you are here. Can I invite you to come on up?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to people out there as well in the digital world. So I'd just like to say a few words about collections as data work. So Thomas has already in his slides mentioned the Data KBR project at KBR, the Royal Library of Belgium, in Belgium, obviously, and that is one of the implementations. But I want to sort of take a step back and look about the work that we've been doing with Gustavo Candela and other colleagues related to collections as data in the common European data space for cultural heritage. So I don't know how many people have heard of this common European data space for cultural heritage already. So probably about 20% of the room-ish. Okay, let's see how we go. So Beth asked us to think of different challenges and things we should be thinking about to help this conversation starting. So Thomas has just mentioned it as well. I like to think of cultural heritage data as humanities research data. So one of my hats is DARIA, the digital research infrastructure for the arts and humanities. So we're really supporting arts and humanities researchers in using cultural heritage data for research. So within the context of RDA, how can we think of cultural heritage data as humanities research data? And a couple of years ago now, Daria wrote a position paper called Cultural Heritage Data from a Humanities Research Perspective. I think this was important to start thinking about this, and with things like Open Science, the European Open Science Cloud, if we can get cultural heritage data moving into that research space, then I think that opens up a lot of opportunities for us as well. As part of this project, so the Common European Data Space, which I will go into in a little bit more detail in a second, Daria is the partner leading on this, something we're calling a collections as data workflow. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, and that builds on the work of the International GLAM Labs community as well. And then very much like Beth was just saying, how can we make all this happen? So it's all very nice to have high level statements and workflows and that sort of thing, but how can we shape and make sure this workflows come into practice? So a couple of things. This slide comes from Europeana. And I assume many people will know, but Europeana is a digital library, archive, museum, audiovisual archive, everything to do with cultural heritage in Europe. And they are the data steward, let's say, for the development of the Common European Data Space for Cultural Heritage. You can find out more details here, but there's 4 key elements. So infrastructure, sort of understanding how the Europeana infrastructure can be upgraded or updated to this data space, which will be a lot more federated. How we can look at things like data quality, and then capacity building. Obviously, this is all part of digital transformation and digital services for the public. So there's more information available online. But in terms of collections as data, one of the things that we did was, and my colleague Gustavo Candela from the University of Alicante, and also for the International GLAM Labs community, started building on the work we'd done. So very much inspired by Thomas's work in the States, how we could bring that more as a movement into Europe. So we had a workshop online during the pandemic as well. And then we came up with these sort of 10 steps of how we can start implementing collections as data, particularly for smaller and medium-sized cultural institutions. So like Thomas was saying as well, the importance of diversity. It's not just the sort of large scale national libraries and that sort of thing. It is the long tail of cultural heritage. And then in the Daria context, we've got something called the SSH Open Marketplace, the Social Sciences and Humanities Open Marketplace, which is a curated space that brings together tools, services, data, training materials, publications in the European Open Science Cloud. And we thought in there is a concept of workflows, which are meant to be practical steps to implement these things. And we were thinking this is a great place to be able to put collections as data and provide lots of examples, tips, and that sort of thing. So this draft is openly available, and we'd very much like comments and feedback, and maybe this could be part of the discussion for this, this working group that may come up. So here, and you can have a look at the workflow in more detail. There's 10 key steps, and I won't read them out, but here you can think about, we've already talked about licensing of data and how that's not always easy, how we can help there. Other things, including documentation of the data set, structuring of the data set, how we cite the data set, these kind of things. So if you click on each of those, you can expand and get more examples. And we want to create this as a living document that we can add new examples and help people to use it. And in one of my own organizations, KBR, Royal Library of Belgium, we've been using the collections as data workflow. So we've got a project that is coming to an end in spring next year, where we take and we focused an initial phase on digitized historical newspapers, so the Belgische Press. And I always like to say we're turning the digital library inside out, so the data is on the top. And how can we develop a platform? How can we license that data, structure that data, make it citable, publishable? So this is one of the implementations we've been working on. And in terms of challenges, as Beth asked us to do, so these, what's it, you call them digital surrogates or something, how to move beyond metadata aggregation. So Europeana has done a great job, but it is aggregating metadata. How can we move beyond metadata aggregation in the cultural heritage data space? How can we publish collections as data or cultural heritage data as humanities data from the researcher's perspective? What do the researchers need? How do they need it? I personally not sure that every humanities researcher can use API. or a Jupyter notebook. So we need to think about how we can make that data available in a way that they can use. And how can we take this workflow that has been developed and put it into day-to-day practices? So just some considerations: licensing of cultural heritage data sets, data citation. I think the more that we get our data sets cited in research publications, the more visible cultural heritage organizations can demonstrate their value. How to structure those data sets. Do we really have metadata schemas available, interoperable, that we can share data sets in an easy way? And where should we publish them? Lots of questions there. So that's it for me now. Thank you. I'll move. Sharif, now we have Sharif Islam talking about natural science collections data. And Sharif, if you can hear us, I can move your slides on when you tell me to.
Yeah, I'm ready. Hi, thank you, Sally. I'm ready. Hi, thank you, Sally.
Great.
Yeah, sorry I couldn't be there, but it's a great opportunity here to present the work we're doing with DISCO. So thank you for inviting us. I'll be talking about natural science collections data and what we're working on for the DISCO research infrastructure. Next slide, please. So when we talk about natural science collections, we're talking about the physical objects, the specimens that are preserved in primarily in natural history museums, but we also work with botanical gardens and other research institutions that are collecting these objects. And these collections and objects are, you can think of it as time capsules or snapshots of our planet's biological and geological diversity. But as you can imagine, as nature is changing, some of these objects and the linked data are also changing. So it's a evolving data landscape. So what happened in the last couple of decades is a lot of this museum has been digitizing their data with, of course, catalogs, data aggregation, linking data. For example, there's a lot of publications that uses the specimens, images and sounds, and of course, most recently, a lot of sequencing data are connected to these specimens. And around the world, we're looking into different levels of digitization with minimal metadata to 3D and 2D images and sounds and all sorts of other elements that are going into those. So these are collection objects and data in our landscape, and DISCO is a project currently, and we were in the process of becoming a research infrastructure that will help integrate some of these activities within the European landscape. Next slide, please. So just very briefly, DISCO, you can go to our website to find out more, but what we're trying to do is create an integrated research infrastructure model where a lot of our researchers and users are interested both in the physical objects and the digital specimen. So there's a lot of movement of people and objects, and we're trying to do that in a wider way to lower cost and giving faster insight to the data that are associated with these objects. And there are a lot of cost involved in moving these things and using these things, so we want to reduce that. And of course, fair implementation is very important for all of these data elements. So the whole idea behind DISCO is to integrate these in a wider way. And of course, a lot of this data will be open to be widely used for a global audience as well. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of some of our objects and how they're connected. On the left, you can see a crocodile that has been collected in Indonesia. This is a physical specimen that has catalog number and some metadata associated with that, and their data standards associated with that. And as you can see, there are facts, scientific facts and information associated with these collection events. For example, here we have the collector with the Wikidata identifier. But based on some of these identifiers, there are different projects that has been done to, for example, associated other collectors and then also finding out different information. For example, there's also archival and narrative information that has talks about these collection events. So we also want to link with those. So this is also an interesting example where you can see scientific data and natural science collection data and also cultural heritage data sort of coming in together. So even though primarily these objects are used for scientific research, but there are historical narratives as well attached to that. So our collections are both in the physical collection and the digital collections are built with these objects and links. And I will talk about that more in the next slide. So when we talk about collections for DISCO, we have an idea of what we call digital specimen using the concept of fair digital objects. And the collections are data sets where we can create virtual collections, similar to, the collection objects we will have in the museum. We want the researchers to create these virtual collections for their work. And these are primarily aggregated records. So each record will have a specimen data in a data set. So we're not talking about multiple data sets coming together. These are multiple records of digital specimen coming together. However, there are also challenges with the related objects, as I mentioned. So for example, we have currently experimenting with annotation. For instance, you can go and look at the specimen and attach things to it, annotate the labels, or do handwriting OCR on these things. So all of those things need to be part of the record, but those collectively could also create collections. There are specific classes and elements within that record, but we're not combining those. For example, the different species and organism and different properties. So in a way, each specimen are element in a data set that could come as create a collection. In the next slide, you will see a little bit more detail. So yeah, so as I said, that a digital specimen itself could be a container collection of different things, but we can also combine these things. For example, a digital specimen or collection of digital specimen could have images, and each image will have its PID and different payload and objects. But at the same time, there will be annotation connected to each specimen or a collection of specimen as well. So some of these things we're experimenting with in our sandbox. You have the link here, you can find out more. For example, one of the potential issues we have to deal with that all the annotations that will be individually attached to these records or part of the records, for example, I can go and annotate part of the image that also need to be built into a container as well. Next slide, please. So there's connection between the collection and how we're thinking about data set. Basically, in a way, data set is static, but for example, in our idea of this dynamic digital object and dynamic specimen, we need a different approach. So this is where the fair digital object infrastructure comes in, where we can provide the individual digital objects combined in the virtual collections. So at the moment, we're considering two types, where one could be a latest version of this specimen. So as a researcher could create a thematic set based on, let's say, geographic location or collector's name or any other traits. And that could be assigned a PID, and that will have a specific metadata and fair digital object profile. And that could be also used in citation or linking. But there could be also a dynamic approach for some of the virtual collections as well. And that could be combined with different citation purpose as well. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we're thinking about. So as I mentioned, that we want these objects to be dynamically worked on in a machine actionable and fair way. So some of these workflows will have machine learning and AI and annotation tools. So we would like to work on sharing those resources. Ideally, we don't want to recreate those tools. So if somebody already has, for example, an annotation tool, we'd like to incorporate that within our infrastructure. And as I mentioned, there are some interesting links between natural sciences and cultural heritage data. So how can we bridge that gap for example, different collections of data could come in together, archival resources, narratives, next to specimen collections. Could be two different collections coming in from two different museums, but they could have links. So we'd also like to be link those things and also do operations on them based on some of these tools. So those are two things I would throw out for the community to think about. And I think that's it for my presentations.
I can see that. And now we have Bethany Anderson, who's going to talk about scientific archives as data and data in scientific archives. Bethany, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. And just give me, I can move your slides on for you. So just give me a shout and I can move the slides on when you're ready.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate. And apologies for being late. I had a bit of a technical glitch on my end, but I'm glad that I was able to finally join. So yeah, I guess we can probably go to the next slide here. So hello, my name is Bethany Anderson, and I'm the Natural and Applied Sciences Archivist at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, or UIUC, as we say. In my work, I focus on documenting science and technology at UIUC. And as a part of that, I work with a broad array of science units and labs, as well as faculty in the sciences and engineering, to acquire, transfer, preserve, and make accessible personal and research papers, as well as administrative records. I also get the opportunity to work with scientific archives in a number of interdisciplinary settings because much of the scientific work that's being done, especially here on campus, is very interdisciplinary. So I've worked on two projects that I wanted to mention that have involved either datafying archival materials or working to especially generate data from analog materials that have been digitized. The first is an experimental pilot project called the Cybernetics Thought Collective, a history of science and technology portal project, which was a project that I worked on with several colleagues between 2017 and 2019. And we had received a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities that focused on using computational approaches to digitized archival materials related to the transdisciplinary scientific movement of cybernetics, and sought to explore how we might create access to a computational archival project and the data it generated that is in concert with current and emerging needs for digital scholarship and accessing archives. At the same time, this project also sought to ask questions about how we can explore the boundaries of the provenance of scientific production and the implications for scientific archives, and whether computational methods open up new ways to explore the complex context of creation of records. This was a collaborative project between the University of Illinois, the American Philosophical Society, the British Library, and MIT. And as part of this, we sought to use an experiment with machine learning and natural language processing tools to explore cybernetics and its thought collective, as reflected primarily through the correspondence, journals, and publications of this network of scholars who were connected through mutual affective and intellectual bonds. The second project that I've worked on is something that is still very much in progress, that I should note. And it's I'm part of an interdisciplinary team of folks here at the UIUC Library, as well as from the College of Agriculture, called the Morrow Plots Data Curation Working Group. And since 2018, we have been working to identify, aggregate, curate, preserve, and make accessible the historical data from the Morrow Plots, which are the longest running agricultural fields, experimental fields, I should say, in the Americas, and second in the world after Rothamsted in the UK. As a longitudinal agricultural experiment, the Morrow Plots provide insights into the effects of soil rotation on various crops and the impacts of different variables such as fertilizers. And thus far, we've gathered and curated about 100 years of yield data, a portion of which was derived from analog materials that are held in the archives where I work. And if you're interested in learning more about either of those projects, I've included 2 QR codes on that slide to recent publications about both of those as well. So from having worked on these projects, some preliminary conclusions that I've come to are that we really need to understand data very broadly. So for example, in the context of the Morrow Plots project, while some of the data found in archival materials was easily to identify as data, so for example, it might be in the form of quantitative information about the plots that was listed in a grid-like way. So for example, numbers that were reflecting the yields of the crops as they were noted at specific years. But there's also a lot of other data about the plots that can especially be drawn from more narrative sources. So for example, factors about environmental conditions or fertilizers used on the plots over time. So one of the things that was a main takeaway for me was that we really need to think critically about what we mean by data when we're talking about that in an archival context. Next slide, please. So in terms of challenges from having worked especially on the Cybernetics Thought Collective project, which solely worked on with more narrative materials, especially correspondence, we had a lot of trial and error with various machine learning tools. But even before using these tools, we had a lot of questions about what kind of models we wanted to use in the first place. So moving forward, if we want to use similar methods or machine learning in natural language processing tools on archival materials, it would be really beneficial to have some sort of automated but flexible workflow in place, which is kind of pie in the sky at this point, but one can still dream, I guess. And also for projects that focus on materials related to a specific scientific domain or field, it's really important to get input from the folks from those domains or fields themselves, not only as experts in those fields, but also as potential users of these materials. And this is something that was really important for both of the projects that I've worked on. But, we really need to think carefully about how we can do this in a way that's sustainable and also respectful of folks' time and bandwidth. And lastly, moving forward, I recently applied for a grant with a colleague to employ some of the same methods and tools that we tested on the cybernetics materials, but focused on women in science and specifically women in home economics and the domestic science movement. So fingers crossed to see if that comes through, and we'll see how we can build on that work. So yeah, that's what I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions and get your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Riitta Peltonen from the National Library of Finland, Finna Services. In this context, don't think National Library as the holder of collection. Think us as a national IT house providing IT services for other cultural heritage organizations. So I'm a usability engineer working in a software team. So I'm not a metadata expert, for example. I guess here we are as an example. We heard a couple of so many cool projects, but we are kind of like the how to say, even of a boring infrastructure in national level, trying to be the infrastructure for all sized organizations, small, medium, and large, and to be the interface towards the larger audience as well as towards the research. And Finna Services specifically combines materials coming from over 400 libraries, archives, and museums under one search service and API services. Basically, on this level, we don't do anything manually. For example, Europeana fixes metadata manually. We don't do that. We based everything on standardized automated processes. And we've been doing this for 10 years. So this is actually an anniversary year for us. And we basically work with everything coming from libraries, archives, museums. We harvest the data through their harvesting APIs with standardized metadata formats. We combine them under our one Finna index, And then for outside, we have this one search website for all of this information for kind of wider audience, but also for researchers. And then we provide APIs for those ones who want to automatically access it. So we have a search API, and then our recent addition is this RDA BO harvesting interface, specifically requested by the Digital Humanities Research. We are also the European aggregator in Finland, so same material that is harvested to our index, it can be provided towards Europeana if it fills their criteria. For purposes of search services, we are unifying the metadata, but through our APIs, we offer all the original metadata available if the user prefers it that way. Since the day one, kind of like our focus or the target has been the reuse of the materials. Nowadays, also this automated reuse. Since the day one, our policy has been that all the metadata coming for us is CC0. No, nowadays, we can even say that no watermarks on pictures. We have strong recommendations backed by the Finnish ministry that include CC licenses or right statement markings on the materials. And most of the new digitizations have those. Older material, not necessarily so. And we've been kind of doing this connecting information across the sectors all these 10 years. So we promote the benefit of good quality and interoperable metadata. And often we need to be the one who says that, okay, could you museum, some archive, please discuss with each others about this interoperability of the metadata. And we promote the support of ontologies. And the National Library of Finland is also developing a couple of the Finnish ontologies. And we support agent metadata if available, and National Library of Finland, for example, maintains the agent database for library purposes. So basically we have good basic level national infrastructure up and running. Our harvesting APIs, it's for the purpose of digital humanities research, but they haven't experimented it with that much yet. I know that there's some things going on with it, and for example, the Helsinki City Museum of Helsinki said that they had some experimentation with it, and they said that it worked for their purposes, giving their data for certain university much better than their own APIs. But still, the kind of like the real use hasn't been happening. Hopefully, during the next couple of years. So, but kind of the next thing is that we would really need to go into nitty-gritty level with the digital humanities research, that how they want to use our APIs, and is it working for them, how we need to make it better, and how we need to work with the organizations so that they make their metadata structures better. So what we see that already coming in the next couple of years. In general, we have been creating a kind of strategical focus areas for us for next 5 years. And this datafying cultural heritage materials is definitely one of them. So we haven't kind of like really concreted yet what it actually means for us, but it's going to be very important area for us. Just this autumn, there was really recently a news that National Archive of Finland, they will take the URN service into use. National Library of Finland happens to be the Finnish URN service provider. So it's going to be implementation with them and experimenting that how URNs work with archiving data. We'll see how it goes. That hasn't been planned it anyway yet. Then we have a funding application going on with FinClaria, which is kind of like Claria and Daria combined in Finland, for doing a cooperation project with them. So really going to sort of a research, kind of like do user research among the researchers, that how do they want to use our APIs, and then improve our interoperability with their infrastructure. My colleague Julia is here, so if we have the project up and going, she will be the one who researches those needs of the researchers. Then Beth asked us to think about the challenges. I'm the newcomer for the Research Data Alliance, so I had difficulties to select just a couple of ones, because basically when I was reading the early recommendations of the World Fair project and the work package 3, I was like, yeah, if I get answers to any of this, I'm gonna be happy. So basically, from the Finnish area of infrastructure, we already had the request that, yeah, this documentation about the process of selection, scope, and completeness of data, yeah, this would be awesome. So we haven't studied this one yet, but since we work with the different kind of organizations, we think, for example, Archiving World has existing processes for documenting this type of information, and their systems and metadata structures supported kind of like hierarchical data. So there could be kind of already existing good practices and metadata structures that could work for it. But obviously, the processes have been developed from the physical world point of view. So the digital world would bring something new into this. But this could be a good starting point, that how to improve that one. Then the citation models. Yeah, if you take a citation from UI, it's bad. But already with the current metadata, we could do it better. But sort of we definitely need some kind of a fallback solution without URNs and PIDs. That what would be the good citation model. But already it would be good to think about what's the ideal one. Plus, we have in practice come up with that. If you have a CC licenses with attribution request, and perhaps in the future, the traditional knowledge labels also have attribution request, that should be probably somehow worked into the citation as well. And generating that automatically might not that easy, especially because the organizations tend to add there the wish that they could be attributed as well. So that would be very useful for us. This kind of like communicating the copyright things with CC licenses or right statement things. That's a kind of a we have up and running thing for that, and even the will to do that in Finland. But the kind of like communicating restrictions beyond those, for example, the rights of indigenous people or minorities, that's something that we need to work in the future. And past 2 weeks, we've been in practice discussing that, are we ready enough to apply something for related to traditional knowledge labels? We weren't yet, but we don't want to drop the ball there, but we need to do it in a way that the kind of will comes from Sami peoples, which is the kind of like the only indigenous people around in Europe area. That's kind of like for important for, and of course the Nordic countries should be driving sort of that approach together with them. And so it needs to be done right. So we don't want to rush it. And in general, this kind of like this support for organizations to make hard decisions that is certain material under copyright legislation or not. So there's a will and technical means to relate to information about the CC, the copyrights with the CC licenses, etc. But it's hard for small organizations to decide that, especially from archives, they have this kind of materials on a gray area that they're not necessarily something that should fall under the copyright legislation with the longer period of kind of like protection times. They could fall under some other legislation with the shorter sort of a periods of protection. So examples when it's clearly okay to sort of say that this is not a copyright righted material, or maybe clearer exceptions to the copyright legislation for the opening material for the research could be very useful. And that should come from the kind of like a international background, or kind of something that you could really lean on. And obviously, we're going to see that this persistent identifier, it's going to be a very interesting thing for museum and archive data, and we don't even know how to start opening. And as a aggregator, we are not even the correct ones. It should start from the collection owning organizations, but that's probably one of the fields which could use really good examples and recommendations. Because we work with so many different kind of organizations, we see that the existing collection systems, they have very different approaches that what's a one item. So the most straightforward ones are the like one digital object per physical object. The other end is like hundreds of different kind of digital objects per one physical thing. So it's it's gonna be interesting field. I probably am over the 7 minutes, but hopefully this was interesting for you guys.
All right, thank you so much to all the presenters. We're clearly passionate about what we're doing, and we're excited to talk about a lot of different issues and challenges. And I think we all went over time, and there's actually not a lot of time left for discussion. This always happens to me in RDA sessions, but we do have a little bit of time, and I have some prompts, some ideas that could drive a discussion that is kind of focused around creating an IG, but I'm going to leave it open to the floor if anyone would like to comment or ask questions specific to the presenters as well. Nope. Do we have a roving mic, or is... Okay.
Hello, I'm Claudia Medeiros from Brazil. I love this session. And because I'm very interested in taking care of some data collections in Brazil, I became a member of a coalition or a mailing list, whatever, called Digital Preservation. And I wonder if the presenters are part of that, because I keep following the discussions and I don't remember having seen this kind of issue, but I don't read everything.
Can you say that again with the...
It's called, well, I'm looking at my email here, you know, where DigiPres or something like that. It's called Digital Preservation. It's, oh, he knows where.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Is it you?
It's DPC or iPres, or there's a few preservation, but yeah.
It's part of iPres, yeah. So is everybody who presented in that?
Well, I can say that the Digital Repository of Ireland is, but I don't think that this particular conversation is one that we've brought to iPres yet. So maybe that we need to. Does anyone else online want to answer that question? Are you DPC members? No, quiet. Sally, have you got
we this time, I'm not quite sure who the we was, but we had a webinar together with the DPC looking at where digital preservation is. So we were trying to think of digitized collections and born digital, and we found that we had 3 national libraries. I think it was the French National Library, the British Library, and the National Library of the Netherlands, looking at how digital preservation, and they're large-scale organizations too, so this will be a different story in different organizations, but looking at where digital preservation is looked after or not, because it's not in all organizations as well. And if you bring research data into the mix as well, that is adding another level of complexity. So I think it's really important to think about this as well.
That is a good point. Mickey, would you like to add something?
Yeah, hi, Mickey Lindlar, TIB. Is a research institute as well as a German National Subject Library of Science and Technology. You actually beat me to my comment. I wanted to point out the same thing. And I think it's very typical of GLAM institutions to sell themselves under value, I think. And if we look at ourselves, we have so much experience in preserving analog materials and digital materials, and GLAM institutions are at the forefront of digital preservation, and we continue to fail to bring this to to events like this one, and in particular the question of how that ties to your World Fair recommendations, because I saw that you only mentioned preservation in there once, and it was pretty much as an afterthought when it comes to documentation, whereas it should actually tie into all FAIR principles and other principles as well. So that's a particular question from my end on how you plan to integrate digital preservation knowledge that large GLAM institutions have to the entire World Fair discussion.
Oh, that is a very good question, and I'm not surprised you asked that. You're right. We didn't talk about digital preservation a lot. I think with the idea being that not all partners in the GLAM space are as engaged with that. And so when we were talking about sort of our second recommendation, which was focused on technical metadata, we were thinking about preservation metadata and preservation processes. So surfacing preservation work and information about changing digital surrogates and how, and that ties into the citation model suggestion as well, in that oftentimes we replace kind of the access copy, but we hide the digital preservation copy. We kind of hide the original. And the original is actually the thing that people are most likely interested in. And we need to surface all of the parts of the process that might produce different iterations of a particular digital object or digital image, so that it's not just hidden administrative metadata, that we're not just talking to ourselves, that researchers and people using our collections can see the life that they've lived. And I think a little bit of that comes from the physical conservation world as well, where there's more effort now to basically not hide restoration work, not to make it restoration, but if you do a conservation treatment on a painting, for instance, you're going to want to show and talk about the fact that you did that. Why don't we do that with digital objects as well, with preservation, with digital preservation? So we should be talking about that more, is my answer. I don't know if anyone else online wants to add to that as well. I'm mindful that we have hybrid participants, but I can't see the Zoom room, so I don't know if anyone's asking questions.
I can offer one thought from the panel. This is
Go ahead, Thomas.
This is Thomas Padilla. Just to self-identify myself. I think on the collections as data work that we've been doing to serve as like a broader community engagement, I think we've kind of been trying to almost work backward with respect to the digital preservation question, partially by focusing more on what we observe in researcher practices with respect to reproducibility. And trying to sort of assess like what aspects, the aspects that support reproducibility in the sharing of research data could be replicated in standard digitization workflows, and the kinds of metadata and formats that we tend to produce just generally in our digital collections. So I guess the short of that is trying to learn from reproducibility what might need to be accounted for in general collection practices to better support preservation downstream.
I've got two questions in the room as well. Rita, did you want to just come up here?
I don't have a question, but more like a comment for that digital preservation part. National Library of Finland is also one of those who in Finland do kind of like this born digital preservation of, for example, internet stuff and that kind of things. But they haven't been the customer of Finna services because that much of the new things have so much more of these copyright related problems, so they are not allowed to open it openly to the internet. So we immediately need to kind of start have a system, but which requires kind of like that it's behind of some kind of a protection, and you only give permissions for people who really have rights for it and that kind of things. When with the other cultural heritage data, we have been more working with the open issues. But then, of course, on the other cultural, kind of like in older cultural heritage materials, there are material which one, for example, contains personal sort of sensitive information, and it's not allowed to open provide it openly in the internet. So we actually had a project in National Library of Finland related to that one as well, but it kind of like it didn't get the funding to get from the proof of concept level to actual getting into really into the usage. But hopefully it's just a couple of years thing and it would continue later on, but you never know about, because it's about the funding from the ministry. But there are also that kind of a cultural heritage materials which cannot be put behind an open API.
Yeah, so you're responsible for the preservation and you are recording information, but we have the same problems as with other fields, it turns out, where sometimes we need to control access and determine who should have access. Laura, did you want to? Oh, Sharif has his hand up. Sharif, would you like to talk?
Yeah, just very briefly. So one thing we often see from our, at least from the European funding and large-scale funding for digitization is they don't usually include long-term storage. I mean, they will have support for the digitization, but usually the long-term storage, like the actual storage cost, oftentimes, need to be supported by either the national government or local institutions. So most of our museums don't have that capacity. So depending on the national data support, we see a lot of variation in different countries about how this preservation will work. But it always sort of boils down to just plain storage cost. So that, I think, need to be factored in when we apply for projects as well. Yeah, just wanted to mention that.
Right, yes. The more creative we get with digitization, the larger files we provide, the more storage and the more cost that there often is on the institution that is hosting this material. Did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Juuso Marttila from Jyväskylä University, Finland. And I would like to raise in addition to these great comments about the infrastructure viewpoint, the viewpoint of the researcher, where we find big semantic problems on telling researchers who use these materials on how they can use them. They may have been like historians citing these materials from archives for hundreds of years. And now we are trying to reinvent the wheel for them and trying to go to their faculties and tell that this is how you should do the things. And we are losing them fast. And another problem is that how we can then tell them that how they could participate in this open science, because they cannot republish the data they were already using, but everybody is saying, please publish this. So we really need this kind of infrastructure with fair digital objects that they can cite, that they can build up. And that's a really big part of getting them back to this discussion, because otherwise we are just forgetting traditions that we already have and forgetting people that have participated in kind of open or at least transparent science for hundreds of years using GLAM institutions. But they are now falling behind and we are leaving them behind because we are not talking anymore at the same language with them when we are heading this way we are going now.
Yeah, that's a really good point that ties into, I think, something Sally was saying or in her presentation, that you need to bring the researchers along. You need to pay attention to what it is that the researchers are asking for. I know that we only actually have 2 minutes left, so I kind of want to continue that thread, but does anyone online have any kind of final comments so that we don't forget that you're there with us too? Okay, no, we're good. We're good there. So something that Thomas and I think, have talked about, and I've probably talked about it with other people, and other people have had these ideas, is how do you connect the research to the materials themselves? They're often in different systems. Looking at the infrastructure at the National Library of Finland, I'm thinking, oh yeah, of course, museums and publications and libraries and all this information coming together. But how easy is it to point to an original material object, perhaps that exists in a museum, and show all the research that was done on that particular object, to show the greater context that actually is informing that record, which is probably changing in response to the research that's being done about that material object as well. I think it was Sharif who was talking about versioning at one point in one of his slides, the idea that there's kind of the latest version of a record as well as a more kind of canonical version of a record, so that you can see that cultural heritage records, or in this case, you know, natural heritage records, often change. All right, with 2 minutes left, I think maybe we can wrap up this session unless there's, oh, Sally, you have one more.
I just wondered if we could come back to the original question. So
oh my God, yes.
Do we think it's a good idea to set up a special interest group? And if maybe just a show of virtual hands or physical hands, and then what would be our next steps? Where would we, do we want to start with the digital preservation question? What you were just saying about linking to between cultural heritage and research. There's so many things we could do. So
thank you very much for that, Sally. Yes, I've got all this information in my brain, all these great discussions. What are we doing with all of this? That was the point of this meeting, is do we want to continue to talk about this? So let's do the show of hands that Sally suggested. If you're in this room and you'd be interested in joining an interest group, well, okay. Definitely, okay, we have some interest. I don't know, Laura, maybe you can report on hands that were raised on Zoom.
There are no
Okay, we have, I don't know if people on Zoom can hear that, but there's 2 comments that Laura is going to relay to the room from Adam. Oh, Adam's going to speak.
Am I? How exciting. Hello. Hi, room. Hi, Salzburg. Sorry, I couldn't get there. Hey. So just following on from the very last comment, we actually are working on a persistent identifier called RAID, which gathers loads of things together. It's kind of unlike other PIDs that you might have heard about that are for single points. It's a project or narrative persistent identifier, and you pull lots of things together onto a timeline for narrative. We use it for portfolios, we use it for projects, and we use it to gather lots of different things. So it entirely speaks to kind of like that last point. We are currently looking at developing, very much for this case, an exemplar for like kind of a GLAM repository. We particularly were speaking to Jenny Basford at the BL, but more than happy to like kind of speak to others who are particularly interested. Sean Ross, who's in charge of RAID at ARDC, is actually there in Salzburg. If you hunt him down, or actually walk up to him nicely, because he's a nice guy, and I think he'd be a bit threatened if you actually tried to hunt him down. But if you find Sean Ross, he can talk to you more about RAID, or you can ping me as well.
Okay, Sean Ross or Adam, who I'm hoping if you have access to the shared notes document for this session, you'll leave your name and maybe leave that offer in the document as well. For those of you who are maybe not familiar with RDA, there is actually a shared notes document that you can access through the RDA plenary program that should have some, I have a diligent note taker over there. There should be some notes from this session. You can leave your name there as well. And then we will talk about perhaps having a virtual meeting of those who are interested in taking next steps to form a group that will continue these conversations.